Next, an hour-long committee hearing on the evidence-based funding model for elementary and secondary education. Speakers include Dr. Brent Clark of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, Michael Jacoby with the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, and Ralph Martiri, the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability.
Go ahead.
So good afternoon, Chairman Davis and members of the committee. My name is Brent Clark. I represent the Illinois Association of School Administrators. We represent superintendents and school administrators all across the state of Illinois. Last year's historic passage of the evidence-based model turned Illinois in a new direction in terms of the way we move money around the state, out of the state, to school districts. And so for that, we want to thank you for that heroic act. Although it took all summer, we still collectively achieved the goal at the end of August. So thank you for that. The base funding minimum started to flow in September, shortly thereafter, and stabilized schools, and we had no schools closing as had been threatened prior to the passage of the bill. We conducted approximately 30 to 40 trainings across the state of Illinois between January and March, primarily with school administrators, and then later in the spring with some teacher union presidents discussing about how the evidence-based model would work and how the money would flow and how they could spend it once they received it in their district. As you know, and as Robert Wolf from ISB testified, the new tier funding started to flow to districts in April. So at this point, they've received approximately 50% of the new tier funding. We're expecting they'll receive the last half of that by the end of the fiscal year. And as a result of that, districts are now spending time with their boards, with their communities, and with their teachers discussing how they're going to take their new tier funding and apply that to their school district to improve academic achievement for all of their kids. The 34 cost centers that have now been identified, I think we've all referred to them as 26 or 27 elements, but practically speaking, there's 34 cost centers. Those are identified, and the trainings have been conducted to focus districts on spending those new dollars in as much as possible around those 34 cost centers. So as we go into FY19, if we can find the teachers and the personnel, as you are well aware, I'm sure, there is a bit of a teacher shortage beginning to show up in Illinois. There's a bit of an employee shortage showing up in Illinois in certified positions. So if we can find those people, you're going to see jobs posted, you're going to see jobs created in school districts like hasn't been done in the last 8 to 9 years because of the cuts in education funding. Now, following a long tenure, spiral, if you will, downward of funding for schools, and with that, what was obviously a cynical view of the state by many people, and particularly people in our ranks, there is a palpable sense of excitement about beginning to improve schools, beginning to have a new accountability system that they can incorporate against the funding model. And you're going to see, I think, a turn in attitude toward the improvement of schools and the ability to put people on the ground to do things with kids. So as you consider the state's FY19 budget, I would respectfully request that the minimum funding level be appropriated, and that's $350 million. Keep in mind that there's another $50 million that would need to be set aside for the property tax relief component that's a part of the bill. We're not sure how many districts exactly will access that pool of dollars, but we do need to stick with at least $350 going through the formula in order to continue the move from where we're at in terms of adequacy another year closer toward moving all districts at least to the 90% point. And with that, I'll turn it on over to my balance of my panel members.
Thank you. I'm Ben Boer, Deputy Director with Advance Illinois, and you have a presentation in front of you that I'll be speaking to. I think really appreciate both Robert's and Brent's remarks, and I think the first thing just to sort of take a moment and breathe is the formula really worked. It really focused the dollars that we appropriated last year and focused them on the districts that are the least adequately funded in the state. As Robert mentioned, $366 million new dollars went through the tiers to districts. 80% of those dollars went to districts that are over 50% low income. Over 70% of the new dollars went to districts below the median property wealth. So both our low property wealth districts and our low income districts got large investments in money. In fact, there is no, after these dollars went in, there are no districts under 50% adequately funded, and I think that's something to be cheered for in the state. About 25 districts made gains of 5% of adequacy, real impact on the amount of adequate funds they have as a district. On the next slide, what you see is where we really started. And as you can see here, we have a wide range of funding amongst our districts in the state. We had districts as low as 46% funded, all the way up to districts that were over 200% funded. The $350 million, as I said, makes a real difference, and you can see the number of students below 60% of adequacy, below 70% of adequacy. Close to 1.2 million students are below 70% of adequacy. So we still have a lot of work to do. So while this was a huge first step, we have to continue investing in the formula to get our students the services and the supports that they need. On the next slide, we have just another diagram, and I should note that these diagrams are on a dashboard that you can find on Advance Illinois' website. It's interactive. You can go through these numbers and look at numbers for particular districts, but also look at where the money has flowed. So what you can see is that the most dollars went to those districts below 60%. Close to $200 million went to districts below 60% funded. Those are the districts that are in the dark red. We also had about $147 million go to districts between 60 and 70% of adequacy. Again, real impact on our district, and I know Ralph is going to give a little bit more detailed breakdown on the averages across the state, because as we can see, the inadequacy is really across the state, and so the money flowed throughout the state as well. Just as a highlight, we have two districts here, Centralia High School District, which was funded at 51% of adequacy, that received $712 new dollars per student, an increase of 5% in their adequacy. And Harvard, that had an increase of about $900 per student in their funding. Critically, we are starting to close the gap, both to the amount of money, the equal amount of funding between our low-income and our non-low-income students, and starting to close a gap to equity. So what we can see here, and is what we knew was the issue in Illinois, a large issue in Illinois, is that low-income students, on average across the state, are funded at 68% of adequacy. Higher income students are funded at about 82% of adequacy. About $245 went to those low-income students, and about $130 went to higher income students. So we've closed the gap about $115. If you look at the resources in the formula, there's about a $900 gap between low income and non-low income students. This is represented, as you may recall, in the Ed Trust report that we've used in prior testimony that showed that Illinois students, low income students, have far less money spent on them than the higher income students. This funding at $350 million, $366 that went through the formula, is what's required to start to make steps to close that gap. And that we see that with the $115 here. And it's really important that we get $350 million through the formula. Why do I say it's important to get $350 million to the formula? Well, there is a minimum funding level in the formula that calls for $350 million. $50 million of those dollars will be taken towards a property tax relief fund. That property tax relief fund is a very valuable item. There are many districts in the state that have very high property taxes. The property tax relief fund is really targeted at districts with low property values. So having a first investment in that property tax relief fund is really a way to reduce the reduce the high property taxes in some of our neediest districts across the state. But it is not new dollars for education. Those $50 million are a swap from state funding, local funding to state funding. And so they don't make any progress towards adequacy. Those $50 million help those districts that have been taxing themselves at unbelievable rates just to keep their heads above water. That's what that $50 million it does not make progress to closing the gaps for adequacy or for equity in the state. And therefore, we need $350 million going through the formula. So with that, I'll end. I know we have a few other panelists here, is that we really need a $400 million appropriation for education funding this year. That will both provide $350 million for the formula, and it'll provide $50 million towards the property tax relief fund. Both are valuable assets to the state, both getting the dollars to those districts that need it the most and getting property tax relief for those districts that that have extremely high property taxes, some over 10% property taxes. And if people have questions about some districts that fall in that, we can provide some information on that. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Hi, there's another PowerPoint you should have in front of you from CTPA. What I thought I would do, and I'm Ralph Martiria, Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, is first thank the members of this committee who voted for the legislation. It is landmark legislation. We have gone from having the single most inequitable school funding formula in America to the best. And now it's a question of seeing whether or not those investments are working as intended, whether or not they're providing value across the state, and whether or not we are seeing these investments as investments that could truly address some of the issues we have found in our education policy. And I decided to pull together data so that you have that information in front of you to make these assessments. The first slide you'll see, slide number 2, shows the funding by geographic area, both under the tiers and the supplemental English learner grant. So if you look across the board, we've identified the different geographic regions in the state as Cook, the collar counties, and the collar counties are DuPage, Kane, Lake, McHenry, and Will. Downstate, CPS, and then statewide in Illinois. So you could see geographically how both the tier funding went, how the English learner grant money went, and then how total funding went by area. The next data points I gave you, just for your reference, was total student enrollment by area, low income enrollment by area, and English language learner enrollment by area. So you now have a nice quick cheat sheet right in front of you with all that data laid out. The next slide, slide 3, breaks down this funding by percentages. And what you will see is Cook County, which has 18.7% of the children in the state, received 19% of the money of both English language learner money and tier money under the EBM funding. The collar counties got 28% of the new money, and they have 28% of the enrollment. Downstate Illinois got 32% of the new money and has 34% of the state's enrollment, and CPS 19% of the money and 18% of the enrollment. So you can see the numbers as far as the distribution of new revenue really very closely tracked student populations. And the differentials can very much be explained by those side categories. So if you look at CPS, they got about 1% more in total funding than in student population that they have. However, CPS by itself has 30% of the low-income students in the state and 31% of the English language learners. That additional 1% was basically formula additions that went to funding educational practices that the evidence suggests are needed for low-income children and English language learners. It's that simple. So the numbers are bearing out that the funding formula really works as intended to get this money to the student populations that need it the most. And so the final graphic on that page, which I also think is just very helpful, is if you look at these different communities, what percent of the students in those communities are either low income or English language learners. And you can see, for instance, in CPS, 77% of the children are low income and 16% overall are English language learners. Downstate, 46% of the children. Cook County, 48% of the children low income. So you have that data right in front of you, and you could look at these allocations of new resources and see that the allocations of resources are well designed to meet the specific needs of the student populations being served in the different geographic regions of the state. The next line item set out on page 4 looks at those school districts that were furthest away from adequacy. These are the bottom 5% of school districts across the state and where they were distributed. You notice there were 43 total districts that made up this bottom 5%, most distance from adequacy in their existing funding before they got their tier funding and their English language learner funding. 12 of those districts were in Cook County, 11 were in the Collar counties, and 20 were downstate. CPS was not one of these districts. They're on here just as a comparison, but they are not one of these districts. If you go over to the very far right, there's the per pupil distribution on average received by these districts furthest away from adequacy. Cook County, $828 per kid. Collar County, $770 per kid. Downstate, $648 per kid. Those are meaningful new investments for these school districts to start implementing those evidence-based practices that are identified in the formula and really enhance student achievement moving forward. Those are powerful and meaningful investments. Now, if you look at that compared to what Cook County got, just as a comparison, so you could see, Cook County got CPS got $212 per kid. This is slide 4 of this PowerPoint. Right? So I just thought you'd like to have that comparison, because when you evaluate this legislation, and yes, as Robert Wolf testified from ISB, we're $7 billion away from being fully adequate. That $7 billion, that doesn't mean that these incremental investments you are making will not help children get a better education that will allow them to achieve. In fact, quite the opposite is true. We are so far away from adequacy that these investments, if you continually make them, the way the formula distributes them, drives them to the communities that need the revenue the most to put into place these evidence-based practices. So you are making a difference. And I'm going to repeat what everybody else on this panel has said about the level of investment. At a minimum, please put that $350 million through the formula. Put another $50 million aside to fund the property tax relief. That's a worthwhile cause, but it's not an educational funding piece. Please continue to make this investment in kids, because it's an investment that really matters. Now, what we are trying to overcome, just so that you know, is on slide 6. There you see Illinois in the red, where the school districts with 0% poverty, according to the Education Trust, had $14,000 per kid for their education. And as poverty went up, you saw that the funding level for the school went down on a straight line basis in Illinois. This is where our old formula left us. And this is why this new EBF is such a powerful counterpoint to that inequitable funding situation. So I think seeing all that data together really makes a compelling case to continue making this investment and, in fact, drive it up some. Now, I wanted to tie some of this investment that the state is making into how schools are funded generally in Illinois, our property tax problem, and make it clear that if we continue down this path and really do the job of putting the money into the EBF, we will take significant pressure off of property taxes statewide to the benefit of taxpayers everywhere. So if you go to slide 8, I'm not going to cover all these slides, much to everyone's relief here. I'm going to jump around, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to hit. I just wanted you to have all the data. If you go to slide 8, you'll see Illinois in the blue compared to the U.S. average in funding education. And local resources, read that as property taxes, currently account for 66% of school funding in Illinois. Whereas the national average, it's only 45%. State funding is only 24% of all K-12 funding in Illinois, whereas the national average is 46%. The evidence-based funding model is going to help address this over time by driving more state resources in and taking pressure off that property tax. This benefits everyone in the state, and it benefits them in a real positive way. You heard Robert Wolf, when he testified, say 7 out of 10 children in this state are in one of these underfunded schools, these schools that need more investment to have an adequate level of resources to put in place evidence-based practices. And that's really very true. But it's interesting, if you look at how our old school funding model worked, and that's page 9, the districts with the most property wealth, flat grant and alternative method districts, really had significant resources to spend on their kids. Our foundation districts under the old formula that's on page 9, our foundation districts had significantly less in resources, and that's because they had significantly less property base. So we were over-relying on this property tax, and that's what created the inequitable funding situation, which allowed in a significant disinvestment in 7 out of 10 children attending public schools in the state of Illinois. Page 10 shows you Park exam scores by percentage of low-income kids in 3rd grade English and 3rd grade math. Go to the far right. School districts that were 50 to 75% low income performed incredibly poorly both in math and in English. 75% incredibly poorly. Compare that to the rest of the state. A primary reason for this is that old school funding formula, which relied on property taxes, and the children in those communities simply didn't live in property wealthy communities, hence were denied resources. You saw how the resources are distributed under the evidence-based model. They are focused on these kids. These kids who have not had a high quality education are now going to see improvements in education because new resources are going in. You are making a difference by funding this formula. I have a lot of other performance data on here, and I'm not going to go through it all because, we don't have time. But I thought it would be very interesting to go to page 16 and look at our demographics by district. Because other disparities we are addressing aren't just based on income, but they're also based on race. And I think that needs to be talked about a little bit. So this looks at the demographics of our state, of where children are located by district. So those districts, go to the very bottom line, that have over 75% low-income population are 11% white, 36% black, 45% Latino. You see these numbers and you look at them closely, and what you see is a disproportionate distribution of African American and Latino children in school districts with greater concentrations of low-income student populations overall. You also saw from our prior graphic that these are the very school districts that have been starved of resources under our old system, but are gaining new and important resources under the new system. What you passed into law will make a difference. The data are compelling here. Flip it to the next slide and look at all kids. This is slide 17. 57% of all African American children in Illinois attend a school district that is 75% low income or greater. 82% of African American kids are in a school district that has over 50% low income concentration. You compare that to 30% for white and 67% for Latinos. Once again, we see these disparities in education funding by income and race that were left in place and or exacerbated and or created under our old school funding system that are being directly addressed by the new system in a powerful and effective way to make a difference. And that's what the idea is when you pass this kind of landmark legislation. You want to make a real difference. So I'm going to jump all the way to the end of my presentation and talk a little bit about return on investment. So if you go way down to slide 26, over the last 30 years, those states which made the greatest investment in building the capacity of their public school systems to meet the educational needs of all their students, focusing on the poorest on up, experienced a statistically meaningful advantage in state GDP growth over states that did not. They had greater growth in worker wages than states that did not. This is over a 30-year period, and this is a statistically significant study that has been peer-reviewed. If you make this investment and continue to make this investment, you will make Illinois more economically competitive. That is the data. I'm going to emphasize a couple of other points here. If you go to slide 28, CTBA actually looked at census data on per pupil spending in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., and looked to see if there are any statistically meaningful correlations between these expenditures, these investments on kids, and economic outcomes. And what we found was across the board, the states that did the best job in investing in K-12 education had higher median and mean wages and income than other states. You could see the effect sizes below in that bottom bullet point. Per pupil spending strongly correlated with median income, 6.66 effect size. To be statistically meaningful, it needs to be 0.25, more than double. Every one of these effect sizes is more than double statistically meaningful. If you make the investment, our economy will prosper. One final point that I'm going to emphasize out of all the data I gave you, and that if you jump all the way down to slide 32, reducing the dropout rate by 1 percentage point in Illinois, the data show will increase wages in our state by over $3 million and will save taxpayers money from reduced social costs, welfare costs, correctional costs, healthcare costs, et cetera, by over $13 million a year. You get a return on investment when you put money in to fund evidence-based practices that the research has shown help children achieve academically. Our old system didn't do that. Our new system is doing that in a powerful and demonstrable way. I hope you will continue to fund it, and you will continue to fund it at least what the statute calls for. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Handy. I'm the Government Affairs Director with Stand for Children. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today in support of investing another $350 million in the new funding formula, which would be a $400 million appropriation. When I think back to the years that many of us in this room spent working on school funding reform, one thing became pretty clear right after we started working on it, and that was there couldn't be any losers. Any change that happened had to hold districts harmless. There could be no winners and losers, and no one lost. So the flip side of that coin is that without new investment, nothing changes. So the funding system can only close the equity gap if we're actually investing the new resources in it to do that. Congratulations to you guys. Thank you to you guys for passing the historic school funding reform last summer. It really was a remarkable accomplishment, and it's just, this is the continuation. We have to finish the job. We have to show that wasn't just a flash in the pan and we did it. We have to show that we're committed to investing in it, and this is really the first year where we need to commit that $350 million to it. I have just a one-page handout, and you'll see this chart here that has kind of red, yellow, and green, and that just walks through like a few scenarios. So the green would be if you appropriate $400 million, $350 million goes to the tiers and $50 is diverted to the property tax relief pool. The yellow would be if you appropriate $350 million, $50 million is automatically diverted to the property tax relief pool. If you appropriate less than $300 million, nothing is diverted to the property tax relief pool. And we're actually in a case where inequity can increase, because if your local ability to raise money is going up, but you're not investing anything or as much from the state side, then we could actually be in a situation where we've passed a much better and more fair funding formula, but also increasing inequity because we haven't invested in it. So I've heard a couple of kind of antithetical things as I'm talking to people about investing this money, and one is, $400 million, that's a lot of money. That's a big ask. But then I'm also hearing $400 million, that's just a drop in the bucket, considering what we really need to fully fund our schools and how far we are from adequacy. So I thought I would quantify a little bit about what $350 million would provide for our schools. It'd be a good boost to our schools. It could provide about a core teacher for every school. It could get us from having one of the worst guidance counselor to student ratios. We're about 700 to 1. It could get us down to the recommended 250 to 1, and then still have some change left over. It's a new guidance counselors is a new obsession of mine. I'm becoming to think more and more about how valuable that is. That we we pass these things. We have career pathways. We really need somebody on the ground to help students navigate that and stay on track freshman year. And anyway, that's an aside. Or we could fund full day kindergarten for every district that doesn't have it. Triple the number of school nurses, add another librarian to every district, and have enough left over to reimburse teachers for the approximately $500 that they each pay out of pocket for school supplies on average. So $350 million is a good step in the right direction, and it will make a difference for our kids. And it is critically important that we get that money in to show we're prioritizing this funding formula that we fought for. So again, thank you for passing the funding formula. Please help that reform succeed by appropriating the resources that it needs to get there.
I'm Mike Jacoby. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, and I'm just going to back clean up here and kind of reiterate and maybe make a few additional comments. First of all, as we've said, thank you and congratulations. I think it really is in order. You have put Illinois in a position to really make a difference that we didn't have as a possibility before last August. And what you're seeing is that the formula is working. In its first iteration, money is going to where it needs to go. It's going to the schools that have the farthest gap from adequacy. It's going to low-income students, schools with low-income students at a greater proportion than it is any other kinds of students. It's also supporting districts that have very, very low ability to provide local property taxes to support their schools. And as we've said, this investment in education is going to pay dividends, and not only to the students that receive additional opportunities, but also to the communities. There'll be new hiring, there'll be additional opportunities for that community to have residents that enter into their own economic space. And those students, as they grow and improve and leave our schools, they will also have an economic impact on the state of Illinois, as Ralph laid out. I think it's important to remember the goal, and that is Article 10 of our Constitution, and that is that all students will be able to be educated to the limits of their capacities. That is the goal. That's what we're talking about. Every single one of our 1.97 million students to get to that point. And the method in that constitutional article is also pretty important for us. It has to be an efficient system of high-quality public education that gets them there. Those are the key terms that we're trying to address through this evidence-based funding model, and it's working and it's beginning to get that done. I think also it's important for you to know that we have a new language in Illinois that school districts are using. Around 34 different cost centers, the effect size of implementing research-based and evidence-based practices. And throughout this last year, we've met with hundreds, thousands of school leaders really across the state to teach them, to have them work through their processes of looking at their own allocation of resources. And I will tell you that it's not just the districts that are farthest away from adequacy that are actually looking at these elements. Every district is taking a look at that. Boards of education are being educated about what to look for in their own budgets in regard to allocation of resources. And of course, once the transparency pieces are in place with the spending plans that are required under statute, that'll be part of their budget hearing, where they'll be talking about how they're going to allocate resources among these particular elements. So that, all in all, is making a difference, and it is working. But we're only in the first inning. If you look at the sheets that were given to you, representing one of your schools, you can see at the very bottom there's a dark band that is the current resources available. Then there's a smaller, orange band that shows the impact in this first year of evidence-based funding, and then the light blue is what yet still has to be done. I like to think about this sort of as we've made a more efficient vehicle because we brought forward these evidence-based practices that can make better income better achievement based upon the income that's available to students. But we've only put enough fuel in it to get it through 1 year. We have a long way to go. The statute requires to meet adequacy by 2027. This was designed as a scalable model, and it also has a minimum in the statute. But that word minimum is minimum. It's not maximum. And we know that there are tough times in terms of funding in Illinois, but honestly, we have a goal in 2027 to reach that adequacy target. It's going to take fuel to get there. If we reduce the amount of fuel, we will reduce the amount of progress. And so when we ask for $400 million with $50 million going into property tax relief and $350 million going into the formula, we're looking at that as the minimum possible investment you could make for this year. And we look forward to continuing to have this dialogue over the next decade as we try to make that constitutional article come to life, where every student is able to be educated to the limits of their capacities. Turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you very much. Before we get into questions, I think something that you stated, Dr. Jacoby, and I think it was in Ralph's presentation, make sure I understand it. So if we continue to make the investments, sometimes we talk about how we save money in the state. By making an investment in this, we have savings on the back end. The governor says it a lot. So I can extrapolate from what you said that as long as we continue to make this investment, or for that matter, if every year we're able to put more in than the $350 million, there's a savings that comes to the state because we're reducing incarceration, things of that nature. Any of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's what every research and peer-reviewed research-based study shows about these investments, and that's the power of what you did when you moved to an evidence-based formula. You moved to a school funding formula that ties the investment into the educational practices that have been shown to enhance student achievement. And when you get that enhanced student achievement in the form of lower dropout rates, higher graduation rates, higher college attendance rates, higher college graduation rates, you see significantly greater salaries, median incomes in your state over time, and significant reduced social costs. So it truly is, and we did a report, and I could make it available to the committee, where we just did a meta-analysis of all these ROI, return on investment, evidence-based return on investment that have been found nationally, and it's really powerful. And so we're moving down that road, Chairman Davis. We have a long way to go, but the investment on the front end will save taxpayers significant money on the back end, and they will raise our state GDP, and they will raise median and mean wage.
Now, the report that you just, first of all, let me add Representative Sosnowski to the role. The report that you just highlighted, is it as simple as if we add 350 in, or 350 in, you can quantify a reduction in the Department of Corrections. You can quantify a reduction in the number of people on public assistance. Things like that.
There are tables like that.
There are tables
I mean,
like
the
that?
investments do have to be going into the evidence-based practice. This is why it's important you passed an evidence-based funding bill.
Right.
But yes, as long as they're going into the evidence-based practices, there is a, for this dollar in, you get that out.
I think if that's something, well, if you could share that study with our staff, we'll share it with the Republican staff. If anybody's just remotely interested in what we can save by continuing to do this, I think it would be great information for us to have moving forward.
I would just add that there's new research coming out of Northwestern that shows that investments in low-income students really show appreciable gains in student results. And, that's the sort of forerunner for exactly the data that Ralph is mentioning. As those students demonstrate greater growth, they're able to achieve higher proficiencies rates in our state. More of them are prepared to go to college. Those students are more productive citizens in Illinois, and that's really the critical, as Mike pointed out, around educating all of the students to the best of their capacities.
And the rate of return on investment is now beyond argument. So we had our study peer reviewed, And one of the peer reviewers of our study was Dr. Eric Hanushek, the head of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, who's written extensively that money doesn't matter in education. It's all about choice, it's all about vouchers, and it's all about getting rid of bad teachers. He peer reviewed our study on the return on investment and passed it, said that yes, the findings were reliable and statistically verifiable. So we even went to someone who's ideologically not in the camp, because we felt it's important to take ideology out of this discussion. When you have research evidence-based practices that really can provide a benefit for your state, we should be all working together to achieve that goal and make that investment. So I will emphasize the fact that we had broad peer review of this research from a broad ideological spectrum.
Okay, I have right now one member seeking question. I know we have one more panel left, so 2 members. Representative Reich first.
Thank you, Chairman. Ben, refresh my memory. If I recall the bill that we passed, the $350 million included the $50 million for the swap, not in addition to. Am I correct?
So if $350 million is appropriated, 50 goes to the swap and 300 goes to the formula.
That's what I asked.
Okay.
That's what I asked. Okay, fine. So basically now you're kind of sliding in here saying, well, we want to take that 50 and move it over to an additional appropriation of 400 instead of the 350 that the bill provides for. Is that what you're saying?
I think what we're showing is that the results of investing $350 million have had a dramatic impact, and we
Well,
need to continue to have that impact.
If we invested $7.2 billion in 1 year, we would have a remarkable return on investment, but the bill says what the bill says, right?
Right, but as Mike said, that is intended to be the minimum funding level, so. I don't
Yeah, there's a little nuance of what you're asking and what we're hearing. You're asking about this year FY18's appropriation.
Uh-huh,
Yeah. In FY18, there was not, the property tax swap was not available to be, so the $350 million that you appropriated.
Went to education.
Went to the formula.
Okay.
So we're talking, when we talk about
But
this.
coming
we're
into the
F19.
new FY19.
There you go.
The 350 includes the 50 for the swap.
Yes.
That is, okay.
It would. If you put 350 in.
And
you don't
50
have
goes to
another-
the swap.
You don't have another 50, then 50 will be pulled out and put in the swap.
Right, so if you don't separately appropriate for the property tax fund, it gets taken out of the EBM appropriate. That's how the statute works.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that. Ralph, property taxes. Oh, yeah. The thing I don't understand is the fact that we have got this huge funding gap that we're talking about filling here, and I'm looking at Harvard, which is in my district. Harvard being incredibly short by about $6,000 per kid. How does adding additional state money, which is going to fill in that blue spot, work to reduce property taxes unless what we do is reform the property tax code to provide for state money that will then go to education? I fail to see how your talk about
Sure.
property tax relief is going to come about when all we're doing is pouring more and more state money into a hole that has yet to be filled. I mean, once the water is above, once we're at 110% adequacy, like the bill provides, Harvard can go ahead and file a referendum for a property tax decrease. But you're not going to see that until, and the bill acknowledges the fact that property tax relief is not available because of this swap and because of the ability of districts that are at 110% and above adequacy to go to referendum. I don't see where in the middle there is any prospect for property tax relief anywhere in the next 10 years during the pendency of this bill.
So, Representative, you have to look at the long game here, and you have to be honest about how these things work. And so, when you look at the state of Illinois and you look at our tax system, state and local, compared to other states, overall, we're Midland in tax burden, 27th as a percentage of income, all in, every tax and fee as a percentage of income. Property taxes always were in the top 3 to 6, always, in reliance on property taxes. So we're always a very high property tax reliant state when you isolate that out. And when you try to find the underlying reasons for that, what you really come to very quickly is school funding, the fact that the state for generations has underfunded it from state-based resources. This is a generational problem. But to actually fix the problem while still ensuring schools have the resources they need to educate their kids will also take time. But the more the state puts in from state funding, the lesser the pressure on the local school districts to ramp up property taxes over time. And what we found, and I will get you this chart, by the way, because we've just done a quick study, every year, and I mean every year in the last, I think we went back 20 years, where the state of Illinois made a significant new investment in K-12 funding, property tax growth completely flattened out in Illinois. And every year that it didn't, property tax growth spiked. So what you see are these correlations between the one and the other. So to take the long-term pressure off of property taxes that was created by the state's historic underfunding of education, you need to drive new money in from the state level. And that will take pressure off. It's not going to be, if you're asking for tomorrow, will we see property taxes flatten out or disappear? No. But I think over time you absolutely will, and the data indicate that that's
But
true.
in your testimony, you said property tax relief, and to my way of thinking, that is a reduction in property taxes,
Okay,
not
so-
a stop,
so
not
to
a
clarify,
flat,
so
not a
to clarify
flattening
my
or-
language, relief on the pressure on property taxes to bear such a significant portion of the school funding thing, which over time flattens it out and will decrease it in communities. Will not happen overnight. We have to put more of an investment in. The faster you fund this formula, the quicker you will see that. And in fact, if you make a major investment, let's say we do something brilliant like re-amortize the debt we owe our pension systems, for instance, just to throw something out there, and freed up, I don't know, $67 billion over the next 30 years, what that would do is allow us to maybe put $1 billion in the formula next year, maybe $1.5 billion. That, in fact, would see property taxes flatten out in the state.
Okay, one final thing. To those out here who are craps players, we are betting on the come line here. We are definitely, we're less than a month into this new money. We haven't even given all of it out. And I know that we're going to have to take a leap of faith here that this is actually going to work. But I think to make a happy dance over the fact that we've actually distributed half of $350 million and all of a sudden all these wonderful results are going to accrue, I think is a little optimistic. I'm willing to take that leap, but I want to be honest about it. And this little schwoogie of taking $50 million and adding it to the 350 is just, we're in the first inning, as Mr. Jacoby said. We're in the first inning and you're already asking for $50 million more money? I can't accept that, Ralph. I can't accept that, gentleman and lady. So, thank you.
Representative Cavaletto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the game, I guess, huh? As I listen here, and in my old age and back in my day, when teachers made $4,400, that was me when I started out. I think administrators probably made $500 or $600 more than that, but not much. But there's a big difference today and all that. But anyhow, my interest is this. What we're talking about, and we're talking about the end result. When kids graduate out of high school, how many of them have at least a 22 on an ACT to get in college? What's that number? If we're going to go forward with people to work and pay taxes and get a job, I think, and we all agree that college is important. How many of those people, what's the percentage of our students that graduate out of high school make a 22 or better going forward? You don't have to give me that now. If you can just, somebody could give me that number. I also know this, if what we're talking about results, then we're talking about remedial classes going away, right? Remedial classes going away, millions of dollars. University of Illinois has almost 100 different remedial classes. So what about the other colleges? The other colleges were teaching remedial classes. What's the savings going to be there? And I hope all this works. The money that we pour in the front end I hope comes out that back end, just like we're talking about now. But somewhere we have to stop that middle end too. And I'm interested in that. So going forward, I think we have to have oversight on what our schools are doing and how many of our kids are really going forward. And I think that's very important, each individual. I admire you for what you're trying to do, and I hope we do get the money for you. This is my last days here, my last 10 days here. We'll have a budget May 31st. I won't have to come back here June the 1st. So
Coach, would you like to let me know who you can talk to about that? I got some people you can talk to about that.
Chairman, you know that. We're going to get out of here May 31st. You'll have your money July 1. Thank you.
Representative Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the panel. It's great to see you all again. A few quick questions. First, I want to follow up on Representative Reich's first question. I think we had a long conversation about the minimum funding level and a lot of conversations we had about this, but one statement that was made was that the minimum funding level requires $350 million new into the formula, and I think his question was asking, is the minimum funding level met with $300 million through the new tier funding and $50 million in the property tax swap? That's the way I read the statute. Is that the way you read the statute?
That is correct. That is
Okay.
correct.
Second thing, there were 2 times during testimony that the term statutory requirement was used, either for $350 million of minimum funding level or a statutory requirement to reach adequacy by 2027. I think that that's probably the recommendation and the goal of the funding formula, and I think that was certainly our goal for those of us who voted for it, but I would be very careful using the term statutory requirement. I think it's important in this committee, as the Appropriations Committee, that we have a really honest discussion about what the policy ramifications are of choosing to fund at certain levels or not fund at certain levels. So I hope that at some point we can have that conversation of what happens if we don't satisfy the minimum funding level. That was an important conversation in the way that we talked about the formula. I think that's something that would be important for us to talk about as the Appropriations Committee. What decision are we making, and how will that impact schools differently if we go to that alternative funding method?
I think those are good comments, and I mean, the 2027 language is in the preamble, and it really says we'll bring all schools to adequacy by 2027. That's the target. But the $350 million minimum funding level is a minimum funding level. It's not a statutory requirement to make those dollars there. But the reason it's a minimum funding level is that we change the formula if we go below that,
Right.
in order to sort of protect the Tier 1 schools from not losing ground.
Right.
And so that begins to change the nature of distribution and also lessens our ability to get to our goal.
Right, and that was an important part of our conversation, that it puts the onus of advocating for new money on all school districts rather than just those who are the most underfunded. So that's a conversation I hope we have in this committee as we make that decision of what can we afford and where do we put our priorities and where do we put our money. So that was just something I would hope I would hear from this committee, and I appreciate your clarification. But again, that's a decision that we have to make as legislators. So don't put that on you guys as saying it's a requirement. Put it on us to follow through with it. Thank you.
Okay, Representative Conyers-Irving.
I just want to thank the panel for all the work that you've done in regards to this model. I do have a question. There was a term, $7 billion. What does that represent?
That's how far away from adequacy we were before the first tranche went through this year of formula funding. So
Okay.
when the State Board of Education looked at the adequacy targets for all school districts in the state of Illinois and compared them with the money that all the school districts in Illinois got, the gap was $7 billion.
Okay. And so we're in here right now fighting about $50 million, and we're $7 billion away from adequacy. Were. Okay. So my only statement that I want to make is that 2027 is 9 years from now.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know about anyone else in this committee, but I'm certainly not content with waiting 9 years before the state of Illinois becomes leveled where all children are treated equally. As far as I'm concerned, that should be taking place right now. So I respect that you all are coming to ask for 350 plus 50, but I'm offended that you're not asking for 700 million. And I say that because why are we tiptoeing around children being equal? This is pitiful. And I respect those legislators that saying, you know, May 31st and this will be their last day. I will hope that those that are retiring, leaving for whatever reason, that they will feel better that May 31st we walk out of here with all children being equal. This is not enough, and we're fighting, and I say fighting because there's talk about $50 million. I'm questioning why we're not there now. 9 years from now? That's pitiful. That's all I have to say. I respect the work that you're doing, and I know that you're tiptoeing because we have to get the votes here, when in fact you should be asking for it all. And that's just all that I want to say. Thank you.
Okay, Representative, you know, CTBA, independent from our partners, has, of course, asked for it all and put together ways to raise the revenue to get there and/or re-amortize pension debt. We'll be happy to work with you on some of those alternatives. I think what you're hearing now from this panel is a recognition of the difficult fiscal situation the state of Illinois is in today, as you're grappling with right now, and trying to ensure that we don't lose momentum and that we at least get a minimum appropriation this year that we think would be very positive, but then certainly would be happy to work with you on moving up the date by which the formula gets fully funded in a rational way. We'd be happy to work with you on that.
So speaking about affording, this is not an option. Being able to afford education, this is not an option.
Thank you very much, Representative. We do have one more panel, but do any of the members have any additional questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate your efforts, all the work that you put in to get us to this point, and your continued vigilance to help us to continue to move forward. Thank you all very much.